Hello. I wanted to talk to you about Shelley Jackson's The Melancholy of Anatomy. Only a little bit about this, really. I want to kind of start with this and then kind of branch into some related things and maybe get back to this. We'll just kind of see how it goes. But you were reading Shelley Jackson's The Melancholy of Anatomy. For the notes for this first set of readings, I gave you a link to a video of Shelley Jackson talking about her hypertext novel Patchwork Girl, and kind of taking the the viewer of the video through the process of what she had in mind and kind of how she put it together, and then reading excerpts from the novel. That was really my first introduction to Shelley Jackson, I think. Um, maybe maybe my first introduction to her was her project Skin. I don't remember which came first, Patchwork Girl or Skin. Skin was a project she did, and you can find the website online pretty easily, where, kind of in a nutshell, she invited people to be a part of the work by having a word from the story tattooed on their body, and then sending Shelley Jackson a picture of the tattoo. And then once you were part of the story, you would eventually get all the pictures of all the tattoos in the proper sequence, presumably, so that you could read the story. And basically, the only people who were privy to the story were people who were part of the story. Now, I'm not a big tattoo guy. I don't mind tattoos. In fact, I kind of like them on other people. I just have commitment issues, quite frankly. But for that, I was actually tempted. But by the time I went to the website, she'd already shut down the application process, and so I wasn't able to become part of Skin. But again, I don't remember if that was my first introduction to Shelley Jackson or if Patchwork Girl was. But in any event, she's an author who has really explored the sort of means by which to tell a story. And again, if you look for her on the internet, you'll find various interviews and so forth that talk about her, or where she talks about her own work and about various ways that she has worked on sort of getting her words out into the world in different kinds of ways. I mentioned on the discussion board, I think, that one of the reasons we're reading this work, I mean, it's terrific, is that it's a pretty traditional format, and so it's easy enough to kind of deal with physically. I also mentioned that I did try to teach Patchwork Girl once in another college course, which at that time it was on CD-ROM, and it just didn't go very well. There were people who just couldn't kind of handle the technology, or maybe legitimately their computers didn't work with it for some reason, but didn't really work out. But this, obviously you can kind of read a book and so forth. So I do want to kind of briefly say a few words about The Melancholy of Anatomy, and then, like I said, kind of switch gears a little bit. Um, we're looking at it in this experimental writing course, and so the question comes up: how is it experimental? And I think it's experimental for various reasons. One is that I think that a concept for a book can be experimental. So, we've mainly been looking at pieces that are experimental in structure and the way authors are using language and internet literature and those kinds of things. But I think you can have a more conventional type of story, but if the concept is experimental, then it still qualifies as experimental. And clearly, her being inspired by this previous text, and then building a collection kind of based on that, kind of turning it on its ear. The original text, The Anatomy of Melancholy, and then she kind of switches that around. And then all the pieces obviously are related to body parts, and so there's definitely a construct here which is very different from what you would find in just about any other book, right? So it's experimental in that way. And then within each of the stories, she experiments with various features. We've talked about intertextuality, where an author will take another text, another poem, another novel, another short story, maybe another kind of art, work of art besides literary art, a painting or a sculpture or an opera or whatever it might be, and kind of bringing that into their narrative somehow. She plays with that, but by inventing her own intertexts. Like, for example, in the very first story, Egg, we get the two short films, The Bad Egg and The Good Egg, and they have the appearance of being real films, but they fit into the obviously the imagery and the sort of themes that she's developing in her story. So again, sort of the invention of one's own intertexts is also something we obviously we all could do. I've played with it myself quite a bit in various books. One of the things I did want to point out, though, is that I think for for an experimental piece, for a concept to work, I mean, it all ultimately comes down to the quality of the writing. And so even though we can point to Shelley Jackson's career as a writer, and we can find all these really, really interesting ways that she has played with getting text into the world and getting her stories into the world, whether it's through hypertext or whether it's through tattoos or whatever it might be. If the writing itself was mediocre, then all you really have is the concept. But she's a great writer, and the media that she chooses to get her words into the world, are worthwhile to explore, I think, because of the quality of the writing itself. And one of the things I've been, kind of focused on throughout, because as you know, I'm a language guy. I love, the play of language. Hang on, I got dogs who are going crazy, and I'm home by myself. So hold that thought. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully that'll be the end of that for a bit. So anyway, talking about the quality of Shelley Jackson's writing, and I've talked about the use of language and using poetic elements in prose, and we certainly see that throughout Shelley Jackson's work. And I highlighted one sentence in particular from The Bad Egg description, which I'm going to read kind of the whole paragraph, I guess, or most of it, but I think you'll hear the part that I particularly want to highlight. But she begins, "The sagging drapes are imperfectly drawn together against the heavy yellow sun which leans on the south wall like a drunk. The faded purple velvet fills the room with a pungent, even hysterical fuchsia light. The flunky who hurries around, heavy silver salter slithering in his sweaty hands, fears and hates the room. On a soaked and blackened Persian carpet rests the room's mistress, an ancient egg, so large the lowest pendants of the chandelier lie about its crown like a tiara." But I think you hear the alliteration throughout that paragraph. We've got the sagging drapes. We've got the sun. We've got the south wall. We got the drunk, drapes and drunk. We have fills the room with a pungent, even hysterical fuchsia light. So in that one sentence, we have faded, fills, and fuchsia. Then the very next sentence, the flunky who hurries around, heavy silver salver slithering in his sweating hands. Obviously, the repetition of the S's there. Fears and hates the room. And it kind of goes on from there. So, obviously we have a very unusual subject matter for this opening story, but the language is very poetic. It just sounds great. It just rolls off the tongue in a very pleasing kind of way. And so, the cleverest concept in the world isn't going to be successful if the writing itself is sort of mediocre, bland, blasé, whatever you want to call it, right? So we're still talking about really, really effective writing, word for word, sentence for sentence, etc. But really, what I want to focus mainly on in this video is the idea of the conceptual novel. This collection is labeled stories, and clearly there are, these independent stories, but also at the same time, they clearly are part of an overall artistic concept in terms of what Shelley Jackson is trying to do in the collection overall. And so I want to go back and kind of look at that idea of the conceptual novel versus the story collection and kind of where all that comes from. And yeah, just kind of throw some spaghetti against the refrigerator and see if anything sticks, so to speak. So, there are story collections that are obviously just, I shouldn't say just, but they're collections of independent standalone stories, all maybe terrific in their own right, but yet they don't necessarily have a thread that kind of binds them together other than having been written by the same author, perhaps. Um, and there are, like I said, lots of story collections like that. They have been less popular over the last 20 to 30 years, meaning that they're a lot harder to sell. Excuse me. And so you've had a little bit of kind of marketing trickery at work over the last couple of decades, where maybe some things that in an earlier time might have just been called stories are called novels instead, or conceptual novels, thematic novels, something like that. Or they're just outright, like I said, just called novels, and maybe the authors think of them as such. So there's a marketing element here, but also, it's also the author's conception of what they're trying to do, right? But oftentimes, the distinction between a story collection and a novel is pretty fuzzy. And we tend to use those terms pretty concretely, like this is a story collection, this is a novel. But there certainly are story collections that sort of start to verge on or overlap with being a novel, and there are novels that certainly have elements of story collections. And so, what's what exactly? Again, I suppose the writer, has a concept that it's either a collection or a story or a novel. I mean, either a collection or a novel, or as a novel in stories or something like that. Or maybe they think of it in some other kind of context. But where does all this kind of come from? And I don't want to give the impression that I'm suggesting that the conceptual novel began in the 20th century, because, as I've said many a time, there's nothing new under the sun. And we certainly can go back throughout history and we can find examples of story collections that certainly function as an independent artistic work. I used to teach the Canterbury Tales pretty consistently. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and as you're probably familiar, each of the tales, is an independent standalone story, but yet it's a frame narrative. So kind of the outward frame are these pilgrims traveling, these 30 pilgrims traveling from London to Canterbury. And then there's, discussion between the pilgrims, both at the beginning and the end of the entire work. And then actually in between the tales themselves, there's some assessment of what they just heard, and all kinds of stuff happening. So that's from the 14th century. And we could find plenty of other examples if we wanted to. So again, I don't want to imply that that the story collection verging on the novel is a product of the 20th century. But I kind of want to start there just because you have to bracket the discussion somewhere. And so I do think in the 20th century, there was a breaking away from the kind of collections we were seeing in the 19th century. And so even though we can go back in history and find examples that seem to fit with this concept of the conceptual novel, or a collection which is functioning as a single, narrative entity of some sort, I want to focus on the sort of transition from the 19th century into the 20th century. And to do that, I want to begin with Gertrude Stein. And of course, we're familiar with Stein in this course because I did a video about Tender Buttons. But another of Stein's, experimental and groundbreaking works for the time period was her collection, Three Lives. And I'm also going to take a look at briefly James Joyce's Dubliners. As you know, I'm a Joyce guy too. Teach a course in Ulysses. Sign up for it if you haven't already. Um, and Dubliners and Three Lives kind of emerged pretty close together within just a few years. But I want to read a little bit about Three Lives and about Dubliners in terms of their kind of breaking new ground, sort of simultaneously at the beginning of the 20th century. And then ultimately, I want to look briefly at you can't have video without the master, William Gass. Look at his novel, Omen Setters' Luck, which could be considered a conceptual novel or could be called a collection of sorts, but we'll talk more about that in just a second. So, first of all, Stein's Three Lives. I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction. Sorry, I want to credit the writer of the introduction, Brenda Wineapple. That's a great name, Wineapple. And she writes, you've written a strange little book. The head of the Grafton Press told Gertrude Stein, and most people won't take it very seriously. Frederick Hitchcock was referring to Three Lives. He suggested Stein write a preface, better yet, let someone else write it, to explain what the stories in Three Lives were about. Stein refused. And yet she never shrank from talking about her work, sometimes in terms that shocked readers as much as the work itself did. Three Lives, she proclaimed grandly, quote, was the first definite step away from the 19th century and into the 20th in literature, end quote. The grand manner came later, after derision and neglect, the price she paid for venturing where others feared to tread. Quoting again, I write for myself and strangers, Stein had acknowledged years earlier, hoping that she would find an audience, which she did. For in Three Lives, she had created something that people would take seriously, no matter what the head of Grafton Press had said. Published in 1909 in a blue and gold wrapper, the book brought her a certain notoriety amongst the cognoscenti as a writer with a unique style, and today it's regarded, as Stein had predicted, as the hallmark of a new and modern century. Stein refreshes our interest in language, claimed poet William Carlos Williams. Novelist Sherwood Anderson agreed. The work of Gertrude Stein, he says, consists in a rebuilding, an entire new recasting of life in the city of words. When she finished Three Lives in 1906, Gertrude Stein knew she had produced an extraordinary book. Quote, it will certainly make your hair curl with the complications and tintinnabulations of its style, Stein wrote a friend. I think it a noble combination of Swift and Matisse. That she always referred to painters, particularly Cezanne and Matisse, when speaking of Three Lives was no accident. In 1904, she and her brother Leo purchased the portrait Madame Cezanne with a fan, a striking picture of Cezanne's wife seated in a red armchair. And it was under this painting that Stein wrote Three Lives, influenced by its method. She says, Cezanne conceived the idea that in composition one thing was as important as another. Stein told a friend, each part is as important as the whole, and that impressed me so much that I began to write Three Lives under this influence and this idea of composition. The subject of Stein's three stories is two immigrant Germans and one mulatto woman, and at a glance, the plots of all three tales seem quite straightforward. And then the writer goes into some description of the three stories. It's kind of one novella and two short stories kind of put together. And so, on the one hand, they are standalone pieces, but yet together they're trying to accomplish a particular artistic task, namely to look at the lives of women in the 20th century, early 20th century, and women from different backgrounds somewhat. The stories themselves are different in the way that they're told, some more experimental than others in terms of narrative style, but there's clearly an agenda at work here. And I particularly like the idea that each part is as important as the whole, and that impressed me so much that I began to write 3 lives under this influence. So you have a collection which doesn't have a sort of flagship title piece, which is often the case. Oftentimes story collections are titled such and such and other stories, something like that, which obviously gives a place of prominence to a particular story. But here we have a separate title, 3 lives, and so each piece kind of pulls its own weight and contributes in its own way to the sort of overarching artistic agenda. All right, so this is very, very beginning of the 20th century. Again, not implying this was the first conceptual novel or the first collection of stories that had a sort of artistic concept they were working at, but it was a break from what largely had been going on in the 19th century. So while we can go back in history and we can find examples that seem to fit, at least when Stein wrote 3 lives, it was very different from what had been coming in the most recent decades before. Well, simultaneously, more or less, James Joyce was writing the collection, which would become Dubliners. And Joyce and Stein are really interesting figures. They both, considered themselves the greatest writers, pure geniuses of their time, maybe of all time. They both were living in Paris, at least part of the time. Gertrude Stein essentially lived there after moving there as a young woman for the rest of her life, with brief visits here and there, including one brief visit back to the U.S. But mainly she was in Paris for the rest of her life. Joyce, on the other hand, kind of moved all over Europe, but he was in Paris for a good deal of it, and he was in Paris when he was working, on Ulysses, and when Ulysses was published, and so on. And so they both kind of had their admirers, their kind of followers. Now, I just recently read, I don't know how true it is, I read a book about Paris in the 20s, and that writer, and his name is not coming to me, I apologize to him in absentia, but he claimed that, and this part I knew, that both Joyce would have these, literary gatherings, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes in his apartment or whatever. And of course, Gertrude Stein was sort of famous for her salons that she would have in her apartment. But this writer claimed that there were writers, artists, etc., who could sort of orbit both authors simultaneously and would get invited to both Joyce's literary events and to Stein's salons, but both the kiss of death was if you mistakenly complimented the other in either of their presences. So if you were at one of Joyce's events and you said anything positive about Gertrude Stein, you were off the guest list the next time around. And the same thing was true of Stein, that if you were in her company and said anything, appreciative of Joyce's work, you were done. You were not getting invited back. Again, I don't know how true that is, but that's what the writer claimed. But Joyce was, again, trying to do something different. He was working on this story collection, and the history of the publication of Dubliners is sort of a, that's an epic tale in itself. But let me read just a little bit of the foreword here. And again, sorry, I want to give credit where it's due. Colum McCann is the writer of the foreword, and he says, Dubliners has been on our bookshelves for exactly 100 years now. Hard to believe. 100 years. From the handset type of a printing press to digitized downloads of today, the collection still manages to slip under our skin and reveal who we are. Written mostly in 1905, Dubliners was ripped up, burned, Baudelarized, rejected, resurrected, lost, dismissed, forgotten, thrown away, flogged, flayed, and eventually celebrated. Joyce spent almost a decade trying to deal with one rejection after another. He submitted it to a total of 15 publishers. Parts of it were libelous, they said, parts filthy, parts anti-Catholic, parts admittedly gorgeous. Nobody actually doubted that the young writer was masterful, least of all the young writer himself. But when Dubliners was finally published on June 15th, 1914, it sold just a few hundred copies. All that craftsmanship for so much silence. One can imagine Joyce walking along a canal in Trieste, turning a corner into a shadow, a shade. Still, he had already begun to write the early drafts of Ulysses. He knew his own talent. The fire was in him. He wanted more recognition, the curse of all storytellers, but there were enough reviews that recognized the promise and some that knew it was a genius. It was, and some knew it as genius, rather. Nowadays, Dubliners has been absorbed into our literary landscape, but in the early part of the 20th century, it was the sort of book that hadn't been seen much before, certainly from an Irish writer, and much of it shocked the conventional literary world. Joyce was flinging open the door of the forge. He had written most of the stories while in Trieste, but the coal to his imagination was his own life in dear, dirty Dublin. The collection is methodical, even mathematical in its construction. Stories center first on childhood, then adolescence, then maturity. This is a similar structure that he eventually uses in his first novel, The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But here he's kind of playing with that idea or trying it out in Dubliners. It confronts notions of nationalism, paralysis, solipsism, mediocrity, greed. Joyce was unafraid to dwell in the alleys of the ordinary. He stated that he wanted the Irish people to have one good look at themselves in the polished looking glass. A little bit later on, Joyce was stepping boldly into his future style. He was also beginning to inhabit the territory that great artists finally carve out for themselves, using what he knew in order to go way beyond what he should possibly know. Let me skip ahead just a bit. Sorry, I'm trying to find exactly what I wanted to read here. It is clear that Joyce intended Dubliners, at the very least, to be a realist study of his native city, a work representative of Irish experience conducted with unflinching Ibsenite moral rigor. Writing to William Heinemann, to whom he had first sent the manuscript in hopes of publication, he insisted, quote, "The book is not a collection of tourist impressions, but an attempt to represent certain aspects of the life of one of the European capitals." So, again, I could go on from there, but I'll stop in the interest of time, perhaps. But again, it's a collection, but Joyce clearly had an artistic vision for the entire collection. The collection actually grew over time. When he originally first started sending it out and getting rejected or getting sort of tentative offers of publication if he would edit this or take out that. But then he eventually added more stories to the text, and so the version that got published ultimately was actually larger, longer than what the original version of the story was. So yeah, it took him 10 years to get it published, but it actually grew over those 10 years as well. So perhaps it's just as well it didn't get published right away because the pieces he added are themselves, of course, masterpieces. Just a side note here, as I mentioned with Tender Buttons, much of Gertrude Stein's work was self-published. Ultimately, her lifelong companion, Alice B. Toklitz, kind of founded her own press to get a lot of Gertrude Stein's work out to the public. Similarly, James Joyce, not exactly self-published, but in order ultimately to get Dubliners published, he had to agree to buy enough copies to help the publisher to at least break even. So sort of subsidized publishing, if not exactly self-publishing. And again, a lot of great works, that's how they came to us, through self-publication or through some sort of scheme, so that publishers wouldn't lose their shirts taking a chance on something that's so bold and innovative that they're afraid that no one's going to know what to do with it. No one's going to want to read it. So early 20th century, you've got works like this coming out. Another work that would fit in here is Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. Sherwood Anderson, of course, was a part of the Paris scene. I just quoted him talking about Gertrude Stein's Three Lives, but his Winesburg, Ohio is on the one hand a collection of stories, but it's also it has an overall artistic concept. There are little pieces that he wrote to sort of help to glue more so the narrative together. Not that it needed help. I'm not trying to say that, but he had an idea about how he wanted the whole collection to come together and so forth. And so he did that not only through stories about various residents of Winesburg, Ohio, but through these pieces that he also wrote that went in between sections of those stories and so forth. And so as the 20th century kind of went on then, as I mentioned, in recent decades, it's sort of fuzzy in terms of, well, what's a collection? What's a novel? What's a novel in stories? What's a conceptual novel? And there really are no, finite definitions. Like I said, it sometimes is, well, what's the authors say they are, but oftentimes it comes down to what the publisher wants to call it and deciding, what they think is the most marketable term to use. In my course on the long story and novella, we kind of get into that aspect in particular. When does a short story become a long story? When does a long story become a novella? When does a novella become a novel? Who decides? That kind of thing. But I did want to talk briefly about then William H. Gass's first novel, Omen Setters' Luck, published in 1966. And it definitely, kind of put Gass on the literary map. It was soon followed in 1968 with the collection In the Heart of the Country and Other Stories. In that same year, Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife came out in 1968. And then in 1970, his first essay collection, Fiction and the Figures of Life, was published. And that too was a sort of, landmark achievement. That's a book that many other writers have turned to for inspiration and for technical, assistance and so forth. I was a couple of years ago, I did a paper largely on Gass, but I also talked about Cormac McCarthy. And in researching for that paper, I discovered that when Cormac McCarthy was a struggling novelist, which he was most of his career for a good 20 years before he finally, started to become a bestseller. But when he was struggling early on, particularly, and had almost no money to speak of, his editor, Albert Erskine, did all kinds of things to just sort of help him out, to try to just keep him afloat so he could keep writing. And one of the things Erskine would do would be to get Cormac McCarthy books that he wanted to read that he felt would kind of help him in his own writing. And one of the books that he asked Erskine to send him was Gass's Fiction and the Figures of Life. And it's a book that I've read a bunch, turned to a bunch, I've quoted a bunch in different papers and that kind of thing. But anyway, back to Omen Setters' Luck. It's a novel, or is it? It is a book that itself has a strange publishing history. Gass wrote an afterword for the publication in which he describes that publishing history. And just kind of in a nutshell, Gass, after laboring for years on the manuscript, had it stolen out of his office at Purdue University. And he even knows who stole it. He doesn't name the person explicitly, but talks about the person via a pseudonym. And then he had to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. There was almost nothing to sort of help him do that other than his own memory. And of course, he was devastated, as you can imagine, when he had the one manuscript. It's hard for us to imagine today because of computers and we have multiple copies of things. I've actually had the problem of getting something published, and when it came out, realizing, oh, son of a gun, somehow they got hold of like an earlier draft, and it's not actually the final draft that I wanted them to publish. So it can get confusing. We have so many different versions of drafts floating around out there. But in the 60s, obviously computers hadn't come along yet. Word processing certainly hadn't come along. And so Gass wrote on a typewriter. Some writers would use carbons. They might have carbon copies, but oftentimes a manuscript, a finished final draft was a singular thing. And especially a novel that's hard to retype. It's a lot of work to retype an entire manuscript. So anyway, it was stolen. He had to rewrite it. He acknowledges in retrospect that it was probably all for the better, because when he rewrote it, it became a much better book than what it would have been had it not been stolen, had he not had to rewrite it. But anyway, it's a novel, but yet it is a collection of three separate parts. Now they're not separate conceptually or thematically. The main character of the book is a guy named Brackett Omen Setter. It takes place in Gillian, Ohio, in the 1890s. But each of the sections is told via the persona of a different resident of Gillian. So, like the first section, the triumph of Israbestus Tat. And so Israbestus tells his story, his recollections of Brackett Omen Setter, and what kind of happened with Omen Setter and his family from Israbestus's that's hard to say perspective. And then after that section, which is about 30 pages, we move on to the love and sorrow of Henry Pember. And again, we switch focuses here. And now we're talking about Brackett Omen Setter through Henry Pember's lens, if you will. And of course, he has sort of his own story that's connected with Brackett Omen Setter. And so we get that section, which is longer. It's 40 some pages long. And then we get the final section, which is the Reverend Jethro Ferber's Change of Heart. Maybe the best writing in English ever written and published, the Ferber section of Omen Setter's Luck. And that's not just me saying it. There are a lot of writers who agree that it is just spectacular. But it's the longest part of the book and finishes the book. So you've got these three distinct sections, one fairly short, one slightly longer, and then one much longer. They're held together because they all focus in some way on the character of Brackett Omen Setter, although Brackett Omen Setter doesn't have his own section. He's always seen via the perspective of these other characters and talking about him and what they think kind of has gone on with Brackett in this community and his family and that kind of thing. So I think this novel kind of, is in that sort of gray area. It's published as a novel. It received accolades and awards as a novel. But if you look at the way it's constructed, you certainly can make a case that it's a sort of conceptual novel or maybe even a collection of stories. And of course, the stories were published independently of each other and appeared outside of the eventual book. So anyway, the difference between what's a story collection, what's a sort of conceptual novel, and what a novel is kind of fuzzy. And so as you are, writing, you may have a clear idea in your head. I'm definitely working on a story that's just independent. Or maybe I'm working on a story that I do see as part of maybe a collection of some sort, or maybe you're working on a novel, and that's fine. But I do want to kind of impress upon you the sort of fluidity of those terms, and to not think of them as too confining, because I think you can kind of connect the dots somewhat on them, and they can kind of morph one into the other. Just kind of very, very briefly, my novel, which I called it Crow Song for the Stricken, which came out in 2017, I'm sure there are folks who might look at that and say it's more of a collection of stories. I definitely had things like Dubliners and Winesburg, Ohio in mind as I was writing it. I don't mean to imply it's up there in the pantheon of literature with those kind of books, but I was sort of modeling to some degree what I was trying to do. And so on the one hand, they are standalone stories. Each one of them was independently published, some of them multiple times, reprinted here and there. A couple of them won awards along the way. Nothing too spectacular, but still, I appreciate any kind of accolades like that. But they do hold together in the sense that they're all in the same geographic location. Just about all of them take place within the same year, 1957. There are reoccurring characters. There are events that are talked about that, happen or maybe mentioned in one story and then expanded upon in another story. I used a sort of method of composition that is a little bit unusual, maybe. I wrote the first story, the title story, Crow Song for the Stricken, and didn't think of it as the beginning of what would become a book that was a novel. But I wrote it. I liked it. I mentioned in the story that there's something funny going on with the Abernathy's. I just kind of mentioned that in passing, having no idea what was going on with the Abernathy's, neighbors of the main characters. But after I finished the story and I liked the sort of feel of it, and I was interested in kind of staying in this place, this physical environment, and kind of headspace as well, I decided, well, what is going on with the Abernathy's? So I, decided to write a story about that. And then that, of course, alluded to this other character or that other event. And so then that would become, the impetus for writing another story. And so eventually this sort of world kind of fleshed itself out. But it was sort of self-replicating, references in one that were just kind of off the cuff almost, then would be the inspiration to write something else. It's a strange book. I put it out into the world, self-published, of course, not knowing, what the world would think of it. Because of its strangeness. But lo and behold, it met with quite a bit of approval. Kirkus Reviews gave it a starred review, which is nice. It also identified it as one of the best indie books of that year, 2017. It ended up winning a couple of awards, and then being a finalist or quarterfinalist in some other contests. And so a book that I thought was so strange, maybe people wouldn't even know what to do with it, ended up being to date, one of my most or the most award-winning or whatever book that I've written. Again, not major awards, not trying to play it up like that, but just has gotten some recognition and some good reviews elsewhere and so forth. I wrote another novel in the meantime, Mrs. Seville, but then I decided to kind of come back to Crow Song. And one of the stories I like best in that novel is about a character named Old Man Stevenson. And it's his 100th birthday in that story. He's referenced in several of the stories in the novel, but this story is kind of his focus. And he has this woman named Biddy who has been loyal to him for decades. His own children have abandoned him, but Biddy, has been loyal to him like a daughter all these years. But I don't get into why that is much or at all, really, in the story. It just is. And so I started thinking, I think in 2018, why is that? Why is this woman so devoted to Old Man Stevenson? And so I ended up going back in time 50 years to 1907 and writing a story about Old Man Stevenson when he was just 50 instead of 100. And then Biddy is a little girl at the time. And so that story, which I called First Kings, set me off on this other writing adventure. And I've been working on it since then. And I'm kind of taking some of the ideas of Crow Song, but trying to tighten them up. And what I mean by that is it's a series of standalone stories, but yet at the same time, they are all working to construct a novel, and the time frame, instead of being roughly a year, is more like 72 hours. And there is this, terrible snowstorm that's going on kind of in the background of all the stories. And so that also is sort of giving some binding material to the work in progress as a whole. I really have been enjoying it. And so far, I've had pretty good luck with the stories, as I kind of alluded to a couple of announcements ago. But anyway, the point here is that you can certainly do work on stories. You can work on a novel, but there are these things that are in between. These conceptual novels, these story collections that have a sort of theme or their own kind of artistic agenda, and so you can kind of occupy this gray space in between, and you can find acceptance for it. So it's not like if are neither fish nor fowl, that you're just going to kind of be lost in never land, publishing wise. There are publishers, there are reviewers, there are contest judges out there, readers hopefully, who can appreciate that sort of in between work, whatever it might be. All right, so I'm going to stop there and wish you well.